Irrational. I wonder how fucking rational you would be if you were put in a psych ward for no fucking reason, and had some nurse pumping you full of drugs you didn't need. How fucking rational you would be if people were calling you a violent criminal. What in the hell ever happened to innocent until proven guilty? You haven't been proven guilty of any crimes, Remy said, although he knew that wasn't going to make any difference to her. In the eyes of some people in this town, she was guilty. Her pale green eyes went cold as ice. So this is how you treat everybody who gets assaulted in this town, she said, her voice thick with sarcasm. Lovely. She reached up and rubbed absently at one of her arms. Remy scowled when he saw the multiple, mottled bruises there. Bruises in the shape of hands. Fuck, how often had they been drugging her? Why had they been drugging her? Because of what had happened to Law? Or was it something else? He didn't know, and just then, he didn't care. He only knew two things: none of this fit and she had bruises on her. Those bruises really pissed him off. Focus, he needed to focus. He shoved all of that out of his mind and looked up, staring at the nurse, who was still there, holding that damn syringe in her hand. Why don't we step outside, he suggested softly. Reaction settled in and left Hope shaking. Grabbing the blankets, she hauled them up and huddled under them like a rabbit. Staring out the narrow window, she wished she could just fade away and disappear. Forever. But she knew she couldn't. She might have escaped another forced dose of some sedative, but this wasn't done. That was the lawyer. Remy Jennings. She remembered him. He was probably here to get her to say something, make it easier for them to arrest her. Is there anything left? A cool breeze kicked up, blowing her hair back from her face. She could smell the scent of wet, charred wood, grass, and the coming promise of fall. Next to her, Ezra sighed. The frame of the house, walls. That sort of thing. Sure as hell doesn't look like much of anything can be saved. She caught his hand and squeezed. I'm sorry. Thanks. He laced his fingers with hers. It was a waste of time, wasn't it? What? She lifted a shoulder, shrugging. Well, if whoever did this had anything to do with that woman, if they burned this place down, thinking that would make you leave, it was a waste of time. You're not going to leave as easy as that, right? Ezra chuckled. It was a hoarse, rusty sound. Hell, no, I'm not leaving. Guess I'm going to have to look for a place to rent, though. You got the money for that? After a brief pause, he said.
Yeah.
I'm good on that front. My grandmother, well, let's just say she hid it well, but she knew how to play with money. She wasn't even aware the fear had been there until it loosened inside her heart. Wasn't aware she'd had the fear until it seeped away. He wasn't leaving. Closing her eyes, she leaned against his arm. It felt good, she realized. Leaning on somebody. Leaning on him. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, to lean on somebody. Maybe he'd even lean on her every now and then. Tired, Lena whispered, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. Would any of this have happened? Ezra pulled her in front of him, cupped her face. When he stroked one thumb over her lower lip, she sighed and shivered. Well, I know one thing that might not have happened, he said quietly. He dipped his head and brushed his mouth against hers. This. He nibbled on her lower lip and then lifted his head a little. With his brow pressed to hers, he said, seeing you at the sheriff's office made me open my eyes. Maybe I would have done it sooner or later anyway, maybe not. But I'm not sorry I saw you there, and I wouldn't have seen you there if you had slept the night through. Then he straightened. With strong, steady strokes, he moved his hands down, rubbing them down her arms, then back up. Besides, if you waking up that night is what is bringing all this on, then it's a good thing. Sooner or later, he's going to screw up, that's how he'll be caught. And stopped. Keep that in mind when you start getting mad, frustrated, or scared. Mad, frustrated. Scared. She slid her arms around his waist and pressed close. That pretty much describes my state of mind at any given time anymore. In a low, heated voice, she added, I fucking hate it. All this shit, it's in my head almost all the time and I can't turn it off, can't stop it, and it's driving me nuts. Her voice cracked as she whispered, damn it, Ezra. What is this? What else is going to happen? Your house. Prather, hell, he was an ass, but I didn't want him dead. Law almost gets beaten to death. Hope's locked up like some lunatic on the crazy floor at the county hospital and they're talking like Remy might have to arrest her. I just don't get it. I don't understand any of it. Lena. He closed his eyes. Shit. Blowing out a breath, he eased back and cupped her face in his hands. Stroking his thumb over the full curve of her lower lip, he murmured, I don't know what's going on with Law or Hope, but, well, what happened here, it's not related to anything else, I don't think. I can't prove it, but I'm almost positive. Her brow puckered. What do you mean? Just call it instinct. I can't say anything else about it until I know, but I don't think the fire is related to what happened at Law's house. None of it. But, dipping his head, he bussed her mouth. Stop, he whispered against her lips. You've got enough on your mind right now. Just stop worrying about the house. It's just a house, anyway. She rested her hands on his chest, stroked upward. Resting one hand on his cheek, she shook her head. It wasn't just a house to you, Ezra. It was your grandma's house. Don't tell me that didn't mean something to you. You might not talk about this place much, but I hear your voice when you talk about her. She meant a lot to you.
Yeah.
She did. And she'd be glad that nobody was hurt, before anything else, Ezra said, turning his face to her palm and kissing it. He couldn't deny the ache in his chest, though. Looking up, he studied the rubble and what little remained of the house his grandma had been so proud of. The important stuff, like his grandma's quilts, her wedding picture, those things had been given to his mother or aunts. Thank God. The house itself.
Yeah.
It had meant something and he was madder than hell over the destruction of the pretty old house. But as he stood there with Lena in his arms, he found himself thinking about Hope and Law. Hell, what if Nielsen hadn't had that weird instinct to check on Hope and Law? Either of them, both of them might be dead. What if he'd left Lena at the house when he went to investigate the fire? What if the bastard had gone to Lena's house instead of over to Law's? It might have been Lena lying in a pool of blood. Involuntarily, he tightened his arms. Raggedly, he whispered, Shit, Lena. I don't think I ever want to do without you in my life, you know that? It just wasn't thinkable. Not anymore. How had this happened? So quick. So strong. So certain. Lifting his head, he cupped her chin and guided her face up. Ever, he muttered. She sighed against his mouth as he kissed her, and when she twined her arms around his neck, aligned her body to his heart stuttered, skipped a few beats. She already mattered so much. Meant so much. Everything. Distantly, he heard a car motor and he swore, lifting his head to watch as a truck rolled past, driving at about half the speed limit. Even from here, he could see the driver and the passenger gawking. "Let's go back to your place," he mumbled against her lips. "This is a regular tourist attraction out here." He cruised along down the narrow little country highway, easily navigating the sharp, winding curves in his big, white van. He could see the back of King's pickup truck up ahead of him. Part of him wanted to get closer. And when he saw King turn off onto Lena's driveway, he was tempted to drive just far enough down the road and do a U-turn, come back, watch them. For now, they had their hands full. Things were a mess, although one thing was certain, they weren't thinking so much about screams, and he doubted they were so curious about the woods or what secrets they might find there. Things hadn't exactly gone according to plan, but regardless, these thorns in his side were now focused on other issues. And that gave him the time he needed to make sure he had dealt with his issues. Caution. It was all about caution, after all. If he had been more cautious in the beginning, none of this would have happened. True, he'd had some fun and he didn't regret it, but in the future, he'd be much, much more careful. So instead of turning around, going back to Lena's house, he kept driving. And because it amused him, when he neared Deb Sparks's house, he slowed down to a near crawl until he saw her shadow in the window. The curtains parted. Fluttered. She disappeared and then he chuckled to himself, slid a hand back over his smooth scalp. Yes, he had to be cautious, but he could still have fun. And it was a lot of fun to toy with Deb, always had been. Part of him wanted to toy with Lena, the same way he often toyed with Deb. But again, caution. The police radio started to crackle. He'd be long gone before the first cruiser even got here. As Ezra came to a stop in front of her place, Lena asked softly, "So how much are you wishing you hadn't ever decided to move here?" "Not even a little." He pulled the keys out of the ignition and opened the door. She was already climbing out by the time he got around the truck. Caging her in, he leaned in and rubbed his lips against hers. "Fucked up as everything is, I'm where I want to be, Lena. That's all there is to it." Her sigh caressed his mouth. "You're a strange man, Ezra." "No. Just one who's willing to deal with the bad shit. You got to take the good with the bad, darlin'. That's how life plays out." She laughed, but it was a sad, lost sound. The good with the bad. "There's a dead woman, a dead cop, my best friend is in the hospital, and one of his best friends is being held in the psych unit. Your house gets burned to a crisp. That's an awful lot of bad shit. Where's the good to balance it out? Right here." He hooked a hand around the nape of her neck and touched his brow to hers. "I've got all the good I need right here. Ezra, honey, I've got to tell you, I'm flattered, but I don't think I'm good enough to balance out that much bad shit."
Yeah.
"You are." He caught her mouth in a soft, slow kiss, ending it with a series of lighter, teasing kisses that he brushed over her cheek and a trail up to her ear. "Here's the thing, this bad shit? It's going to pass. It will. Always does. But I plan on sticking with you, so you're always going to be here." Reluctantly, she smiled. "You sound so sure of this." "How can you be so sure of this?" "Of us?" "Because it just feels too right." "Nothing's ever felt quite as right as you do, baby," Ezra murmured, nuzzling her neck. "You'll figure it out, too. But until you do, I don't mind waiting." "I'll figure it out?" "Hell, the guy already had her heart melting in his hands. But Lena, as much as part of her wanted to make that jump, had caution bred into her. Bringing one hand to his face, she said, "You're doing a pretty good job of convincing me, Slick." Rising on her toes, she pressed her mouth to his. "Now, maybe I could convince you to come inside, and take me to bed." No convincing was needed, but Ezra doubted he needed to tell her that. Trailing after her, he waited while she took Puck off his leash, and although his hands itched to touch her, although he ached to hold her, he waited by the door while she played with the dog for a few minutes. The moment the retriever came off the leash, he was like a puppy, bouncing around and wagging his tail like crazy. Lena chuckled and said,
Yeah.
"I know. It's been a crazy few days, hasn't it, boy? Maybe we'll take a walk later." When she straightened and turned to face him, he crossed the floor and reached up, drawing the dark glasses from her face and putting them on the table. Then he dipped his head, pressed his mouth to her brow. Her lashes fluttered low, shielding her eyes. He pressed a kiss to each closed eye and then skimmed his lips along one cheekbone down to her mouth. "Wasn't that long ago I didn't even know you," he muttered against her lips. "Now I can't think about going through even one day without seeing you." He cupped her breasts in his hands. "Touching you." He caught her lower lip between his teeth and tugged on it gently. "Kissing you. Tasting you. Ezra." She whispered his name, her voice shaking, husky with hunger. Sliding her hands up his chest, she linked them behind his neck. Need had her shaking. The tenderness in his voice, the gentleness in his hands made her heart clench and ache in the most beautiful way. Tears burned her eyes as he cradled her face in his hands and took her mouth with his. "Nothing happens to you," he said against her lips, and the words were like a promise and a plea, all at once. "You understand?" "I understand." She slid her fingers into his hair. "Same goes, though, Slick. Nothing happens to you." They started toward the steps, and a walk that normally took just seconds took 5 minutes, and they left a trail of clothing behind them. Her shirt was off before they hit the staircase. His followed shortly after. When they hit the landing, he stopped her to remove her shoes and jeans, and when she would have climbed a few stairs, he stopped her with his hands on her hips, pressing a kiss to her spine, and then another, inching lower and lower. Each light kiss left her quivering. When he reached the small of her back, her knees melted. As she grabbed onto the handrail, Lena's head fell back and she swayed, certain she was going to collapse, fall into a puddle at his feet if he didn't stop. His lips brushed against her left buttock, his teeth raking over her skin lightly. She opened her mouth, to beg, to plead, something. But he turned her around and whatever words she'd been about to say died in her throat as he nuzzled her between her thighs. Through the cotton of her panties, she could feel his tongue. She went to push them down and he caught her wrists. "Not yet," he murmured, kissing the inside of her left wrist, then her right. "Not yet," she would have groaned in frustration, but he was already on his feet, covering her mouth with his, and any sound she might have made faded away under his kiss. Oh, could he kiss? She loved his kisses, could get lost in them. Sighing into his mouth, she leaned against him and curled an arm around his neck. He stroked his tongue against hers and she nipped him lightly, then sucked on him. He growled and the sound had her shivering all the way down to her toes. He tore his mouth away from hers, resting his brow against hers. "Bed," he muttered. "Right now." "Bed," she agreed. Ezra took her mouth again, tangling his hand in her hair, the other hand curving over the sleek curve of her hip, holding her steady as he rocked against her. His cock ached and his balls drew tight, heavy against his body in warning. Shit, she totally shattered his control, made him feel like a teenager. Made him forget everyone, everything. But her. She was all that existed for him. Tearing his mouth away, he let her go and said again, "Bed." She laughed, a slow, female smile curling her lips, and then she turned, one hand resting on the banister. He waited where he was until she was 5 feet away, but that in itself was its own sweet torture. He stared at the narrow, delicate curve of her hips and ass, his mouth watering. The simple black cotton of her panties rode low on her hips, and he wanted to peel that barrier away, maybe with his teeth, and spread her out on the bed, stare at her, at each and every curve, learn them all over again, with his eyes, his hands, his mouth. His cock jerked and he pressed his hand against it, swearing. Starting up the stairs, he followed her into her bedroom. He paused in the doorway only long enough to strip out of his jeans and boxer briefs, tossing them into the corner so she wouldn't trip over them if she got up before he remembered to move them. As she neared the bed, he came up behind her and slid his hands up, cupping her breasts. She arched into his hands, a soft, shaky sigh escaping her lips. Pressing his mouth to her nape, he murmured, "I love you." A soft flush turned her cheeks pink. A nervous smile curled her lips.
Yeah.
I'm starting to believe that. And I'm starting to think maybe I love you, too. It hit him, like a sucker punch straight to the heart. Shaken, he hauled her against him and sank down on the edge of the bed. Burying his face against her hair, he rocked her. Serious? Her hand stroked his arms.
Yeah.
I'm not much for saying things I don't mean either, Ezra. I'm serious. I don't entirely understand it, none of this makes sense and it's happening so fast, but...
Yeah.
I mean it. She shifted and squirmed around in his lap until they faced each other. Lifting her hands, she stroked them over his face, over the straight slashes of his eyebrows, his cheekbones, the hard, firm curve of his mouth. Dipping her head, she pressed her lips to that mouth. As crazy as my life has been the past couple of weeks, it feels complete. And it's because you're in it. Lena, his mouth moved against hers, but other than her name, he said nothing. But Ezra couldn't figure out what he wanted to say. There were words, 100 of them, 1,000. But he couldn't figure out what they were. Her hands came up, pushing on his shoulders, easing him back on the bed. He fell back, staring up at her. 2 seconds later, his breath lodged in his lungs as she reached down and closed cool, slender fingers around his cock. She tucked the head against her entrance and his eyes damn near crossed as she started to sink down on him. Skin on skin, nothing between them. Shit. Lena, condom. She stilled. Staring up at her, he gripped her hips. Hell, she felt so good. Silky and sleek and soft. Do we need it? She asked quietly. I'm not going to get pregnant, not right now. And other than that, there's nothing else I need to worry about. Bad idea, it was the capital of bad ideas. Involuntarily, his hips jerked and he sank another inch inside her satiny depths. No. I'm clean, but, fuck. She clenched around him. We should know better, he muttered. Then he arched up. At the same time, he started to rock her against him. But screw it. She smiled and leaned forward, bracing her hands on the mattress just above his shoulders. It brought her breasts just in line with his mouth. Ezra lifted his head and closed his lips around one pink nipple, catching it between his teeth, biting gently. Lena whimpered and clenched around him, milking him, a silken fist. When she sobbed out his name and shuddered, when her nails bit into the skin of his shoulders, it felt like glory, like heaven, completion. Skimming his hands up over her sides, he cupped her shoulders in his hands, rolling them over. He needed to see her, needed to watch her face. He caught her hands, lacing his fingers with hers, and rested his brow on hers. "Lena," he whispered. The thick, dark fringe of her lashes lifted and she raised her head, pressed her mouth to his. Her legs wrapped around his waist and she rose to meet him, strong, steady and sure. Their bodies strained, breath mingled. Hearts raced as one. Her cries rose in the air, underscored by Ezra's low, rough groan. Her name was on his lips as he came, and when it ended, he collapsed with his head resting between her breasts, weak as a kitten, barely able to breathe, and his head, his heart, and his soul completely full of her. She was all he could think of. All he could feel. Reaching up, he caught her hand, held it in his. "Lena." He shook his head, surprised he had the strength to even do that. "Nothing." Shifting in the bed, he moved up next to her, tucking her body against his. She curled against him and he wrapped his arm around her waist, resting his chin on her head. He held her in his arms as she drifted off to sleep, his eyes on the trees just beyond her window. She woke in bed alone. But she wasn't alone in the room. Her skin prickled, and for the span of 2 heartbeats, her body was tense and her fingers curled into the sheets while her mind raced. But then her sleepy mind caught up and she remembered falling asleep in Ezra's arms. She'd slept next to him, and now she was awake and he was here. It gave her the weirdest sense of satisfaction. Completion, somehow. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey, yourself," he said from over by her window. She listened as he crossed the hardwood floors and joined her on the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked as he stretched out next to her. "Just thinking." He sighed, and she could hear the frustration, the anger lingering in his voice. His house, she knew. He was thinking about his house. "I'm going to have to see if I can't find a place to rent in or around town. Call my insurance agent." She stroked a hand up his tense back. Sitting up, she laid her hands on the knotted muscles there and started to knead them. He groaned and his head fell forward. "It could be worse," she said quietly. "I'm just glad you weren't in the house." Her gut twisted even thinking about it. She'd just found him. What if he had been in the house? What if she'd lost him just when she'd finally found him? Just when she was ready to admit what he meant to her. It made her heart hurt to even think about it. "Hey." He reached up and pulled her down in front of him. Staring at her again, she could feel it. Blushing, she buried her face against his chest and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Sorry. I don't know. Just kind of blindsided me all of a sudden. What if you'd been asleep? What if you'd gotten caught inside?" "Don't." He tilted her face up to his and pressed his lips to hers. "Those are the kind of games that can drive you out of your mind. Trust me, I know. I wasn't in the house, and I didn't get caught. I'm fine." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "See? I'm fine." "I know, it's just," to her horror, Lena realized the burning in her eyes was tears. She was getting ready to cry. "Oh, shit. What is wrong with me?" Reaction. He kissed one eye, then the other, and when a tear broke free, he wiped it away. Wrapping his arms around her, He rocked her. Pressed close against him, listening to his heartbeat, she ran her hands up and down his sides, reassuring herself that he was fine. He was here. Right here, with her. Right where I want him to be, she realized. Right where she needed him to be. That thought lingered in her mind even after the tears passed. Dashing them away with the back of her hand, she murmured, "I feel like an idiot." "You shouldn't." Sighing, she rested her head on his shoulder. There was a breeze drifting in through the window, cool, damp with the promise of more rain. Fall was moving in on them, hard and fast, it seemed, she could smell it on the air. She found herself thinking about the woods bordering her house. And her. The woman. That night, the screams. "It's not over, is it?" Lena asked softly. Ezra stroked a hand down her back and rested his chin on the top of her head. "My gut says no." "The woman found at Law's, you think it was her?" "I don't know. But whether it was or not, it's not over." His arms tightened around her waist and he pressed his face against her neck. "Shit, I don't like to think about you being alone out here, Lena. There's just too much crazy shit going on." She didn't answer. She wasn't about to give up her independence over crazy shit. But as they sat down to eat sandwiches and soup, Lena tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. It was a logical decision. Based on not just her heart, and not just her head. But both. There was definitely crazy shit going on lately, and too much of it seemed somehow related to her. And she was crazy about Ezra. She hadn't ever rushed headlong into a relationship in her life, and she knew she shouldn't do it now, but this didn't feel like a rush. It just felt right. He felt right. The same way it had felt right to major in culinary arts. The same way it had felt right to take the money that had been left to her by her father, and use it to buy the house that had once belonged to her parents when she'd lived here with them as a child. The same way it had felt right to take the job working at Running Brook. Even the way it had felt right to make that damned phone call that might have started all this trouble. Whether they'd known each other a long time or not, if it felt right, what did it matter? It doesn't, she told herself. And once she realized that was the truth of it, it was that much easier to think about it, and smile. "What's got that cat and canary grin on your face?" Glancing up, she shot a smile in Ezra's direction. "I dunno. I guess I just figured something out." She took a bite of her sandwich and then set it down. Licking her lips, she wiped her hands on a napkin and then took a deep breath. While she had the courage, she needed to get this done. "I was thinking, holy shit. I really am going to do this, aren't I?" She thought about how it had felt, falling asleep with him. Waking with him there. "Don't go looking for a place to rent. Stay here." The only response was the sound of silverware clattering to the table, and then to the floor. 10 seconds of silence stretched into 20, and her heart raced as he said nothing. Absolutely nothing. After another 20 seconds of absolutely nothing, she forced a smile. "I guess I wasn't exactly expecting you to be stunned into silence. Maybe I'm just a little confused about why you're suggesting that," he said, his voice hoarse. Lena licked her lips. Her throat was dry. Painfully. She reached for her water and took a sip, then a larger one. After she drained the glass, she set it down. Still thirsty, still trying to find the words. "Well, it makes sense. You need a place. I've got room. So this is a rational, neighborly type of arrangement? No, she reached for the water glass again, more to have something to do this time. Pushing back from the table, she walked over to the kitchen counter. Why did it suddenly seem like that walk took a lot longer than normal? She could feel his eyes, all but boring a hole into her spine, willing her to turn around so he could see her face. She didn't have her sunglasses, and she realized she was nervous about facing him without them. Coward. Filling her glass, she turned around and faced him. She'd been so distracted, so caught up in her thoughts, she hadn't realized he'd gotten up until one of the floorboards squeaked under his weight. Catching her breath, she held still as he reached out, stroked a hand down her face. Is it because you're freaked out by all the crazy? Ezra said softly. I can't say I blame you there. She scowled. All the crazy, as you call it, would be enough to freak anybody out, but no. That's not it, or not all of it. She stopped and closed her eyes. I liked falling asleep with you. I liked knowing you were there when I woke up. I like knowing you're here right now. Licking her lips, she reached out and hooked a hand in the front of his jeans, tugged him close. I just kind of like having you around, Ezra King. What can I say? He caught her face in his hands and tipped her head back. You kind of like having me around, he echoed, reluctant amusement underlining his voice.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, it feels right. She hooked her hands around his neck and pressed her mouth to his. I'm big on doing what feels right. And you. Ezra, you feel right to me. You feel all kinds of right. Do I?
Yeah.
She nibbled on his lower lip. He opened his mouth and she hummed in satisfaction, sliding her tongue into his mouth. Man, she loved his taste. Loved the way he let her kiss him without trying to control it the way some guys did. He boosted her up on the edge of the counter and moved between her thighs, resting his hands just below her hips. But when he reached for the hem of her shirt, she pulled her mouth away and batted at his hands. Stop it. You're going to distract me. We were talking about something. Hey, I can multitask. I can talk and undress you at the same time, he said, slipping his hands under the shirt and cupping her breasts. Lena swallowed a groan and just barely managed to keep from shivering as he pinched her nipples. You can undress me when we're done talking. What do you think? Good idea? Lousy idea? Oh, it's definitely a good idea. He paused long enough to nip her chin. I'd say I'd move in as soon as I could pack, except, well, there's not much to pack. The heavy irony in his voice had the smile fading from her face, and she reached up, rested a hand on his face. I still can't believe you lost it all, everything. I didn't. I've got everything that matters, he said quietly. Right here. He kissed her softly. And if you're sure, if you're serious, hell, yes, I'd love to move in. But are you sure?
Yeah.
She gave him a nervous smile. I'm not exactly ready to talk wedding rings and all, but we've already kind of established we're serious here. She caught his hand and pressed a kiss to it. You need a place to stay, and I think we'd both feel better if I had somebody here with me right now anyway. And I'm pretty certain I don't want anybody else in my personal space other than you. It's logical. It makes sense. He chuckled. You're such a romantic, Lena. You're making me blush here. Oh, I can make you blush, she said, giving him a sly smile. Then she shrugged. It's not just the logic, though. It's because it's you, and it's me. And it's right. That's enough for now, isn't it? His response was to press his mouth to hers. They made love right there, on the kitchen counter. When it was over, he murmured, his breathing still ragged.
Yeah.
It's right. It was enough. For them. For now. I hope you like this series. For more, please like and subscribe for early accesses.